There are 254 town meeting members, 128 constitute a quorum. We're going to debate and we'll eventually come to vote.
So I ask you to support this motion.
I see no hands. Am I missing one?
Need the community these bring together.
I was an elementary school teacher.
I think what we're hearing, two separate issues.
Public art's been an important part of this community.
I urge you to vote yes on this proposal.
Call the previous question.
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. No. We'll have an electronic vote.
I move to adjourn.
We are adjourned.
Yes, hello. We're back again here with Russ Vernon Jones and Caitlin, a UMass student, and we're talking about the recent school vote about whether town meeting and our town would vote to bond out. What was the total amount, Russ, for the vote?
I don't remember what the total bond was, but
I can tell you that in a moment. So there was a vote in January of 2017 in town meeting, and then there was another vote in March with town-wide. And the question was whether voters would appropriate $67 million for the Twin Schools project. And in order to, we would have to borrow money to do that. Part of it would be from a grant supposedly later, but we would also borrow money. And in order to borrow money, there needs to be a 2/3 vote in town meeting. And, well, it's a little complicated, but first town meeting voted the issue of, actually, I'll let you address it, Russ.
Well, the town had a vote in which all voters could participate.
Exactly.
And that won by 50.5%. In other words, the town was basically evenly split whether to go forward with.
And that was with
for
the override. Was that correct?
Yes, that must have been about the we needed an override in order to borrow the money to build the building.
And for just for people to have background about the override, there was a statewide law that says you can't increase taxes by more than, I believe, 2.5%.
2.5.
Without having what's called an override, which means that the public is allowed to vote to see whether they're okay with going higher in a particular year for a particular issue. So an override is for a particular project. So there was a vote about that, and you were saying that the vote breakdown was very close.
50.5% in favor.
Right.
So
townwide.
Townwide, it just barely passed.
Yes.
Then town meeting needed to vote to authorize the borrowing, and because it's an authorization of borrowing, town meeting would have to have a 2/3 majority in order to support it.
Right.
Well, it didn't get 2/3. It got 49.5% in town meeting, which means the town meeting vote exactly reflected the vote of the voters as a whole. Mm-hmm. They're within a percentage point of each other.
Actually, I think the 49% was with the override, was the first vote of town meeting.
Yes, the first vote.
The later vote for bonding fell short of the 2/3, but got a little more than majority. What I found for the numbers was, this was on January 30th, 2017. There was a vote, 123 in favor and 92 against in town meeting. So that was 57.2% of town meeting voted for the borrowing of the money, but you needed 2/3.
Well, my recollection is a little different, was that there were folks who who wanted to challenge the town meeting vote. And in order to override town meeting, they went back to the voters.
Exactly.
And again asked the voters. And they needed a 2/3 from the voters, which they didn't get. The voters gave them 56, 57%.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Then we had another vote in town meeting, and again they got 56, 57%.
Yes.
Within a percentage point of where the voters were, once again.
That's right.
But not 2/3.
Exactly. And so the voters' town-wide vote was held on March 28th, 2017, and the yeses, in other words, people who wanted to borrow the money, which had to be 2/3, fell short. That was 56.1%, as compared to the town meeting vote that was 57.2%. So they almost mirrored each other.
I think it's incredible how much town meeting did vote with basically the same division, the same percentages as the whole town. I think it's an incredible testimony to how representative town meeting is.
And so sitting through that whole process, could you talk a little bit about how you felt the process was, and also either your position or your impressions of the whole process?
Well, there was a lot that led up to this. And I went and spoke to the school committee at least 3 different times in the process leading up to this, saying, listen, there are many ways to address equity issues. They need to be primary, but this is not the only way to solve the equity issues. And I said to them, I don't think you have built a consensus in the town for doing away with K-6 schooling. They had a lot of meetings, but they did not actually generate a conversation in town about what I think was the big thing that they were doing.
Yes.
And I even have a letter that I wrote to the school committee in January of 2016, in which I said, remember, you're going to have to come to town meeting. And I believe you have a much better chance of getting support in town meeting if you continue K-6 education with all the benefits, some of which we've talked about, pedagogy and professional community of teachers, the building of relationships. It's also convenient for parents and one of the basic building blocks of community. So, and I was only one of many people who talked to the school committee about thinking the direction they were taking was not a good one.
Yes.
At one point, they claimed they were making this vote on the basis of equity. And in a 5-member committee with 1 person of color on it, the person of color voted against, and the other 4 voted in favor. Now, it's not to say that anybody is automatically right or wrong, but I do think white folks should think twice before they think they're doing something on the basis of equity when the person of color on the committee says that's not the way to address equity, and not what she felt people in the various communities of color were asking for. So there were many attempts to sort of get this on track, and as I say, nobody was anti-school. There may be some voters in the town who felt like, oh, we can't afford schools, but that was not the case for the folks who were having this debate in town with each other, with the school committee, with the building committee, and the administration, or in town meeting. And I was tremendously impressed with the amount of research, the surveys, the interviews, the studies, the comparisons with other districts and schools and what the experience had been. It was an amazing experience of town meeting members in particular putting in huge amounts of work and becoming very expert.
Yes.
I think there are people who think that town meeting voted the way it did because it didn't understand the issues. And I'm sure that's not the case. I think town meeting understood the issues very well. They may have made a good decision, or we may not have made a good decision. I think there are reasonable arguments on both sides, but it wasn't based on not having the facts. It wasn't based on not being well informed. It was based on a genuine disagreement about what's best for the town.
Interestingly, Michael Greenbaum, another former principal,
Right.
he actually voted differently than you, but also came down on the same idea, that he thought that this was an incredible process, and where people disagreed respectfully, in a very informed way. And he has a blog about that whole process. You mentioned about the K-6 model and how that was why you voted against it.
Yes.
I recall there was a teacher who presented at town meeting, and she talked about how having more transitions for children, not just like it's big enough jump when you go from kindergarten up to a bigger school, but to then go from 2nd grade, you have another transition, that's very hard for kids. So
It's also challenging for families to have their children in more different schools.
Right.
And particularly when a school is drawing from the entire town.
Right.
Means the distances that parents are traveling to get to their children's schools, to conferences or a PTA meeting or anything like that.
Yes.
And the busing costs and the the energy fossil fuel issues, with increased busing.
And even with equity issues with parents who have one young child how would they manage having to do pick up at two different schools, or if a child's sick, or if they have after school programs? There's a layer of complexity that would have actually made it a bit harder for a lot of parents. Someone else made an argument about, speaking of fossil fuel, just the buses.
Yes.
Do you recall what that was about? Could you elaborate more?
Well, right now we have neighborhood schools. The bus is going to a particular school, pick up children from the neighborhood of that school, and go to the school. What was proposed was that children from all over town, at one grade level, would go to one school, and from all over town, another grade level, would go to another school. It's more busing.
Yeah.
It's more pollution.
Sounds like a transportation issue too.
And longer rides for children.
Congested roads and stuff. Yeah.
Well, that's right. And also that particular school location is at the end of a one road. It's not Fort River, the parking, you can pull in one way and you can pull out the other way. Wildwood is actually a more challenging parking area because you drive down one road and you drive out the same road. And someone had presented, a UMass professor, about the impact of pollution with doubling the number of buses that are then idling outside the school in a very concentrated place. And she had concerns about that. But so how do you think that this issue impacts either town meeting or how we move forward with the school issue? How do you think we'll get 2 new schools, and what's the next step?
I always have confidence in Amherst voters when it comes to education. We are a town that cares about our schools, and we have always done what needed to be done over time to provide quality education. And I hope we can get lots of aid from the state for building buildings. I don't know for sure whether we should be renovating a building or building new buildings, but I have great confidence that this town can come together and do something very good for children and teachers.
So right now, town meeting appropriated, I think it was like $250,000 for a feasibility study to look at if and how the Fort River land could be used to build a new school, renovate the old, look at all options. And Wildwood, I assume they would be looking to rebuild on the same site if they're looking at 2 neighborhood schools continuing. Do you know much about that process?
I don't know a lot, but I do know that there are a lot of questions about the Fort River site. And before we try to resolve what buildings we have or where we're going to put them, I think we really need to look at that site, and I think town meeting made a good decision, and I applaud the school administration for coming forward with this request. To do a thorough look at that site.
Yes.
Is this a site we should be using for a school building, period?
Yes.
If it is the building that's there something that could be renovated and used?
Yes.
Or not?
Yes.
And I think that's a good question to investigate in much more depth than they did in the previous process. And when we get clear answers to that, we may not like the answers we get, but I think if we have thoroughly investigated the answers and that we can go forward based on the same information. Again, I don't know a lot of details, but I know the school district is also engaged in some very interesting conversations about, is there the possibility for a school which has a dual language program? Are there some special programs that might be put in different schools? We've been talking for decades about the need to have second language instruction, or world language instruction in the schools. And I'm thrilled that that question apparently is getting looked at in a serious way with regard to how we go forward from here.
Yes, and certainly the language issue, charter schools is something that played, I think, a role for some. It did for me with my vote, because one of my concerns was we have an excellent Chinese charter school that draws a number of children. And one of my concerns in town meeting was that if you were to proceed with a plan that more than 90% of parents did not rank as their first choice, you might have a number of parents that would pull their children out of the public school system when there's these other options there's the Chinese charter school, there's the Pioneer Valley Performing Arts School, excellent options for kids. I did some calculations and produced a fact sheet when we were having these votes about they projected that this twin school would save $400,000 to $500,000 a year by combining the two sites. However, each child that is removed from the public school system, back in statistics that were a couple of years old, said that $20,500 is the cost per pupil. So with every student that walks out the door into a charter school, you're losing $20,000. So if you just do the math, if 20 kids, if 20 parents were upset enough about this proposal that, as we saw from the town vote, the town was split down the middle. If just 20 kids were removed, you've lost the profit margin
Everything
for combining
that you
these
had
schools.
saved, right?
If you lost 40 students, you're cutting teachers now. And so we might have, and I found it concerning that there was no economic impact study done whatsoever about the possible possible funding lost if students opted to go to charter schools instead because of this reconfiguration. So,
now, I do think we need to mention that part of this was about a state grant.
Absolutely.
Building assistance being available.
Right.
And
Could you discuss that a little bit more?
I think we need to, these grants are not easy to obtain. They go through a long process. Once you get them, you're committed to following through with what you said you were going to do, which made it very difficult to make any changes in what was proposed.
Right.
And part of what made this so painful is that we did decide not to go forward with accepting, I don't think it was $34 million from the state. And that's a painful decision. For those of us who are educators who want money for schools and want money for schools in Amherst, this was not an easy decision, and I found it very hard to oppose taking that. But we're going to have these schools for the next 50 years.
Yes.
It just seemed to me it was really important that we get it right.
Yeah.
And I wasn't willing to go forward to get the money if we were going forward on the basis of something that wasn't going to be as good for our students and teachers as families as we could have.
And in terms of the grant, so various people presented at town meeting about data they'd looked at from, we're not the first town that's turned back a grant.
Right.
And from what I understood the data to be, towns that voted down the grants but then came back a couple of years later with a different proposal that had more community backing, that they were still funded. Do you have much experience with that, Russ?
I mean, I looked at the data and know that was the case. There is a timeline to getting back in line. We lost a year because people decided to challenge the vote in town meeting and try to get it. We lost a year there.
Right. So the point being, if we had withdrawn our proposal from the grant in 2017, we could have reapplied
when we first made the vote.
Right. We could have reapplied in 2018, but you can't submit a new grant proposal in the same year you withdraw the old one. So because there was a request to have town meeting do the same vote again, we actually lost a year in the grant line. Is that right?
Yes. And again, while I don't know a lot about it, I do want to applaud the current administration of our schools for taking a serious look at what are the options, what are the issues, and what are the potential opportunities
Absolutely.
for doing something in a new way.
Yeah, no, I think Michael Morris has been really great about trying to engage the public, engage town meeting members, and really think in a forward way. Because, as you said, I did an informal poll on SurveyMonkey with town meeting members. Everyone who responded to the survey who voted no said they wanted new or newly renovated schools. Everybody. So I really think there's huge public support for new schools.
I think we're going to get there.
Yeah,
And I'm hope. One of the things it's going to take is we're going to have to give up some of the arguments and pain of the past.
Yes.
We are going to, as a town, have to work together on this. And that's not always easy.
Yeah.
But I think our commitment to excellence in education and our commitment to our children is sufficient that we can do what we need to do.
Yeah. Now, since you're here and you're a town meeting member and a former principal, I was wondering if you had other thoughts about how does town meeting impact schools, or what have you seen town meeting act in on other school issues that you think would be important for the public to know about?
Well, over the years, I was principal for a long time, and we went through a lot of budget cycles.
Sure.
And there was always some sense that even if times were tight, the town meeting was going to back the schools.
Yeah.
And one of the most recent ones is, the Finance Committee had put out a number that needed to be met in developing the school's budget and whatnot. And, it was really hard, but the schools had decided they needed to cut some paraprofessional positions.
The librarians.
And the librarians. And this got to town meeting, and town meeting said, we're not going to make that cut. We're going to put that money back in the budget.
Yes.
And there were people screaming about, oh no, this was developed through a careful, long procedure. But there are value issues here.
Yeah.
And there are questions of how do we as a town want to spend our money.
Yeah.
And town meeting was, from my perspective, more progressive than either the Finance Committee or the Select Board or the town manager, and said, no, we want these positions back in the budget.
I remember that, and so just to put some numbers on it, was $30,000, and my recollection is there were 4 part-time librarians. There was one at each of the elementary schools, and so when we learned this, and we learned this because we're looking through line item by line item, and
town meeting looks at things very carefully.
It's good though, it's thorough.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's part of the beauty of town meeting. Most of us who are so busy, where they're not town meeting, I wouldn't be reading the budget line item by line item, because who has time? Right. But as a parent, I do care. Anyway, so when we learned that these 4 librarians were going to be cut, someone just raised their hand and said, I move that we add $30,000 to the budget, and that these 4 librarians be kept. And I think it was like a half-hour discussion.
There was thoughtful discussion, issues on both sides.
Yeah, and then, but I think pretty overwhelmingly, town meeting voted to keep the librarians. And I found it interesting that I always watch at the end of the year, or in the spring town meeting, we find out, or actually the fall town meeting, we find out how much was left over from the fiscal year budget from the year before. So the fiscal year ends, I believe, in July.
June 30th.
June 30th, thank you. And so what we learned in the fall, after the budget number after the year that we kept the librarians, I was wondering, are we going to be low on money, or how are we going to do? We had over $1 million left that year. So and that the money at the end of the year gets put back into something called free cash, or it can go into different reserve funds. The stabilization fund is one.
Well, it's different for the regional schools and the town schools.
Yes, but in any event, so over $1 million was put back at the end of that fiscal year. So we really could afford those $30,000 appropriation for the librarians, and had we cut them, we would have just put 30,000 more back into free cash, but we would have lost the librarians.
Now, the fact that there was $1 million left, to my mind, is not a sign of bad budgeting.
No,
there are
it's
things
good.
that you must set aside funds
Absolutely.
for. You have to provide for contingencies. And it's wonderful when you don't need them and have money left. But I, in general, I think the budgeting of the schools has been very responsible.
Very good. And that's part of why, as a town, we have a AA bond rating. Maybe you know more about bond ratings. I just know it's very good. It's and it is because we're fiscally wise, which is a plus. There was another school issue. I don't know, you weren't in town meeting at the time, but there was one time when we learned that a Cambodian outreach worker was going to be cut, and that was like $10,000. And but I think Cambodian children, there's a large segment of the school.
There's a sizable Cambodian population.
Yeah.
And it was a very important aspect of our program for Cambodian students, but to some extent for the whole school at Fort River, that we developed some Cambodian educators who could lead those students not only with regard to language learning in their original language, but cultural support. And
that's so important.
So I remember one town meeting about 10 years ago where we discovered there was a line item that was going to cut the Cambodian outreach worker, and someone raised their hand and said, I move that we put $10,000 back into the budget and keep the Cambodian outreach worker. And we did. And but just for people who might not be aware, like overall, we approve the vast majority of budgets. Town meeting does.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so from your experience as a principal, how rare is it when town meeting disagrees with the budget that's been worked over the entire year by finance committee and select board?
Very rare.
Yes.
I mean, I remember one or two other times when we put a small amount of additional money into social services in town. It's money that used to be there, that got cut. But overall, I think town meeting is, we raise a lot of questions, but I think we're very respectful of the work that people do over time to develop budgets and other proposals.
Well, Russ and Caitlin, we're at the end of our time, but that hour flew by. Thank you so much for all your wisdom and your perspectives, and thank you for watching.